The same religion that's capable of hideous acts of destruction can also be capable of moments of healing, of restoration, and of hope.
But educate a girl, and you educate her entire family.
There is a sun within every person.
When that anger sets in, write it. Write the letters, but don't send them. You never want to leave concrete proof of insanity.
Why should we care? Why are we here today on a beautiful Saturday to talk about Darfur? Very few of us, I would imagine, have links, ethnic, cultural, business, or otherwise, to that part of Africa. And so why should we care? So in asking that question, I found an article that maybe I'd read, maybe I hadn't, back in May of 2005 by Nicholas Kristof. Many of you know he's been one of the primary journalists writing about our failure, both worldwide, local, regional, national failure to deal with the problems adequately. And here's what he wrote, and I think it's worth just spending a minute to do that if you don't mind. After talking about the oil richness in the Sudan and the Chad area, which are reasons, and the fact that failed states lead to further terrorist activities and so on, he writes, but there's an even better argument. Magbula, a woman I met at the Kalma camp here. She lived with her husband and 5 children in the countryside, but then as the Arab Janjaweed began to slaughter black African tribes like her own, she and her family fled to the safety of a larger town. In December, the Sudanese army attacked that town and they ran off to the bush. 2 months ago, the Janjaweed militia caught up with them. First, the raiders shot her husband dead, she said in her choking voice, and then they whipped her, taunted her with racial insults against black people, and mocked her by asking why her husband was not there to help her. Then 8 of them gang raped her. After the attack, Magbula was determined to save her children, so they traipsed together on a journey across the desert to the Kalma camp, where a small number of foreign aid workers are struggling heroically to assist 110,000 victims, which has grown much greater today, of the upheaval. Mogila carried her 6-month-old baby in her arms, and the others, ranging from 2 to 9, stumbled beside her. Magbula's family finally arrived at Kalma a few weeks ago, but the Sudanese government is blocking new arrivals like her from getting registered, which means they can't get food and tents. So Magbula is getting no rations and is living with her children under a straw mat on a few sticks. Then a few days ago, her baby died. She and her children are surviving on handouts from other homeless people who arrived earlier and are getting UN food. They have almost nothing themselves, but they at least have the compassion to help these people who are even needier. The world might also respond if people could see what was going on, but Sudan has barred most reporters from the area. I'm here because he accompanied Kofi Annan on a visit, and he jumped ship while he was there. Ending, she writes, Magbula and the 2.2 million other homeless people from Darfur need food and shelter, and President Bush, who's been good about providing some of that, but nevertheless, they all need international community to shame Sudan for killing and raping people on the basis of their tribe. Each time Sudan has been subject to strong moral pressure, it has backed off somewhat, but lately the attention has subsided, and Mr. Bush even killed the Senate-passed Darfur Accountability Act, which would have condemned the genocide. So that's why I'm here today, and I suspect that that speaks for many of you. So it's a great pleasure to introduce Richard Applebaum. He's a professor of sociology and global international studies at UCSB, and he's now the director of the 2-year master's program and the first class, many of which, if not all of which, are present here today, and a warm welcome to them as well. He's also on the executive committee for the Center for Nanotechnology and Society, an NSF funded organization. He received his BA from Columbia his master's from Princeton, his PhD from the University of Chicago. He's authored numerous books and articles on sociology topics, including a widely used textbook, but many of the topics recently have involved globalization and the impact of human rights violations in the labor area. Additionally, he's currently engaged in a multidisciplinary study of supply chain networks and nanotechnology in Asia-Pacific region, including China. So I'm very grateful. My wife Phyllis and I went to Rich with an idea, and it just happened to click with the confluence of the UCSB reaching out to the greater community and bringing more programming off campus. And so we both had needs, and we both got our needs met, and so that's why we're here today. So thank you very, very much.
Let me introduce our keynote speaker, who will also help moderate today, and then I'll introduce the panelists. Rabbi Lee Bycel is Executive Director of the Western Region of the American Jewish World Service, which he just joined recently. Prior to that, he was Senior Advisor for Global Strategy for the International Medical Corps. He also moderates a variety of senior seminars for the Aspen Institute and the Federal Executive Initiative, and he offers seminars on leadership issues, ethics, and strategy for a variety of organizations. During the last 2 years, he's made a number of trips to East Africa, including 3 humanitarian trips to Darfur and Chad, where he visited refugee camps. And I know he also went to Kenya recently with a good, close personal friend of both of ours, a group of people, to look at the slum dwellings there. In the April of 2006, he was in Rwanda for the 12th commemoration of their genocide, and he has visited international medical corps projects in the slums of Nairobi. And on a personal note, 22 years ago, Lee performed the wedding ceremony for Karen and me. And I haven't seen him since then. This is just a wonderful homecoming. Lee, welcome.
I wish I could be as successful in Darfur as I was with Rich and Karen. Good morning, everybody. I know it's a beautiful Saturday morning, and as Rich said, I admire your commitment for coming out on a Saturday morning, those people from the community and Human Rights Watch, those of you who are engaged in the program, and I want you to know you're our future. You're going to be playing a critical role in the years to come. This is not an easy subject to talk about, and often it can become depressing, sobering. That isn't good. It is a sober subject, but it's one that we can do something about. And what I want to do in the little time, the 2-3 hours allocated to me, was that right, Rich? No. In the 15-20 minutes allocated to me, is to share a little bit about this personally. We have the opportunity to hear from 3 experts in 3 different areas that affect the region. But I hope that today we can leave with something even more than has been talked about already, and I'll get to that in a minute. In a few minutes, I'm going to show some of a few slides, just a few slides. But I want to share with you what brought me to this work and why I think this connects to everybody who lives up here in Santa Barbara or Montecito or Goleta. And for those who don't think it connects to them, I think they're missing the boat. Many of you in this room remember this. Some of you were too young. But do you remember when we believed that HIV/AIDS wouldn't come to this country? We actually believed that it would stay over in that continent called Africa, where many of us don't even know the names of individual countries, and we forget that in each country there's an incredible identity, an incredible history, an incredible diversity of culture, and that disease came over here. The diseases that we see in Africa, the diseases of genocide, the diseases of malnutrition, the diseases of waterborne illnesses, they are creeping their way into our soil and into our land. I often think of the quote of Martin Luther King, and it's one of the things that motivated me to start this journey. Actually, about 3 years ago, I had a kind of a career opportunity that would have brought me to Santa Barbara or led me on this route to Chad or Darfur, and I don't know, do you think I did the right thing? Maybe I should have just stayed here in Santa Barbara. But Martin Luther King once said, the true test of a person's character is not where he or she stands at moments of comfort and convenience, but where that person stands at times of challenge and controversy. Regrettably, in the year 2007, we stand at that moment of challenge and controversy. Many Americans would like to think we don't. Many Americans would like to think this is remote, far away, nothing to do with our lives. But as we saw in the 20th century, we saw what we can do to each other. We saw in the Armenian genocide. We saw in the Holocaust. We saw in the killing fields of Cambodia. We saw in Rwanda, and there I particularly mention Rwanda as that certainly many people in this room were alive, were aware, were old enough like me, and what I don't like in any of these discussions is blaming other people. Bill Clinton, who I've gotten to know a little bit over the past few years, and we'll talk about your discussion groups in a while and about the focus of this, we all like to blame presidents, and again, yeah, they do have more responsibility. And Bill Clinton has talked openly about his responsibility with Rwanda. But what I ask is, what did I do during Rwanda? Where was I? I was an adult, and in 100 days, 800,000 people on this earth perished. Did I write a letter? Did I call a congressman? As the late Senator Simon said, if only 100 people had contacted me, I would have called the president. And you all know that in Rwanda, the simple act of jamming the radio waves would have saved 400,000 lives. And being in Rwanda, you feel it, you see it, and you talk to the people and you understand it. So now here we're facing, Rich, if we can go back to the first slide, that would be great. Just go back 3 or 4. Now we're faced with a challenge. What are we going to do about Chad and Darfur? For me, this journey started in the middle. Go back to the very first one. It says human tsunami. It started in 2004. I started learning about Darfur, and as you know, it got very little print time. But it started to intrigue me. I was busy like all of you. Lots of issues here in America. Lots of things. Everybody in this room is involved in great things. And then I heard a commentator say, I forget who it was, but the following. And they said, and I'm not sure this is fully true or not, I'm only reporting what I heard, and for a person like me, this made me bristle. They said, America will never really give a damn about Darfur. And by the way, I always add Chad, and I'll talk about Chad in a minute, because it's black people killing black people. And America still, at its underbelly, has to examine our own racism and who we are. And little did that commentator know what we would learn about New Orleans and the underbelly of this country in terms of racism, in terms of poverty, in terms of what's going on. But I heard all this and I decided, you know what, in Rwanda I didn't do a damn thing. What was I going to do? So I went to a group called International Medical Corps, which is an international NGO in Santa Monica, California. It's like Physicians Without Borders, but they never put money into public relations and all that. They do work all around the world. And I went and I said, I want to spend Yom Kippur, which is the most sacred day in the Jewish calendar. I want to be in Darfur. And I think after they did about 10 psychiatric evaluations, called all my friends and said, who is this nutcase that came in that, wants to go over there? And I said, I want to do a few things. I'm willing to do anything while I'm over there. I've lived in all conditions. I'm willing to help your staff. I want to be with people. I want to look, learn. Number 2, and later on I can talk about things to do, but by the way, that's the easy part. You didn't need to come here this morning to do that. You can write letters. You can give money. And by the way, that's really important in Darfur and Chad. And I believe in having skin in the game. I don't like talk. By the way, that's what I love about President Clinton's global initiative. If you don't know about it, I'll tell you about it later. We can talk about it. You got to have skin in the game or you'll never be invited back. For me, having skin in the game was raising money. I think initially I said I raised $25,000 or $35,000. On the first trip, I raised $150,000. By the way, and I've taken 3 or 4 trips since then, young people have gone out and raised $40,000, $50,000. Anybody can do it. And third I said is, I promise, when I see what's going on over there, to be a voice for these people who have no voice. So I entered that world in Yom Kippur of 2004. And here's a woman I met. She and David, I think, has been there. This is in the Gareda facility. It's a health care facility in eastern Chad, serving a catchment area of 110,000 people. And what I love about this woman is most people, when you take their picture, is they smile. And when people are wearing African garb I mean, she is very beautiful, that long face, but it reflects that sort of life really is okay. As you can see, she appropriately didn't smile. You see that look on her face, reflecting the village she lived in Darfur being burnt down, her husband being killed. I think 3 of her children were killed. Now she's standing at the Gareda camp with this child, and her eyes have that look of, where is the world? Here's one of the things I want you to think about with this. Not what can you do for her, because that really is easy. We're smart. We're sophisticated. In America, 300 million people, we live on 25% of the world's resources. Whether you individually are or not, we're rich. We got to take a cold shower and wake up. We are really rich, and by the way, our way of life is going to end. What will it be like to live on 18% of the world's resources? We better start figuring that out, or the world is going to figure that out for us, and I'd rather us figure it out. Here's the real question I want you to go away thinking about today and talking about with people. In what way do you need her? In what way do we need this woman to have what we talk about in the international community, some semblance of dignity? Food, water, shelter, and the right to live. And just because she might be from the Fur or the Mazalit or the Zangawa tribe, that she too has a right like you or me or you to live. The deep connection, and being here at Casa de Maria is really the right place, Rich, because it's spiritual, it's personal, and there'll only be a solution in Darfur when we really believe that that woman is our sister, that woman, we are reliant upon her for us to ever be fulfilled. It's not an easy concept. It's easy for me to say, write a check. It's easy for me to say, write a letter. It's easy for me to say, get involved in divestment. That's much harder. Let me just say a few words about a few more slides if we can go on, Rich. Just for those of you, I know some of you may not be familiar with the region, and just to give you a sense, most maps we look at are very America-centric. Sudan, which got its independence from Great Britain in 1956 and really has been at civil war ever since then. There was a 20-year war between the North and South. 2 million people were killed in that war. Sudan is a quarter the size of the United States. Largest country in Africa by size. 40 million people living in Sudan. 70% are Muslim. To the west is this country, Chad. Chad, 10 million people, got its independence from France in 1960. One of the poorest countries in the world. There's about 5 or 6 miles of paved road in Chad, and they've taken in 300,000 refugees, nearly 300,000 on the eastern border, all up and down on that border. I can show you more of it. And the people of Chad absolutely amaze me, but also I must tell you, and last night when I was thinking about this and looking at other talks I've given or thinking about notes I've made, it really depresses me that in 2007 I'm still out talking about this. That the world still hasn't said, what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean to have a conscience? What does it mean that in this 21st century, and again, I was joking with Kevin, technologically we've come so far, we've advanced, medically we've advanced so far, scientifically we've come so far, humanly. You remember that little book called the Bible, and whatever our take is, I talk about it in a secular term this morning. If you were writing about the creation of the world, would you have made the third or second story that Cain kills Abel? The authors of that book understood our nature. And there is something brutal in our nature. There's also something profoundly good, something profoundly empathetic, something profoundly hopeful. Let's just go on a few more, and then This is up in Chad. This is where International Medical Corps works, where I've been, Omnibok, Malay, Gareda, Kanungo. And again, those are a bunch of names. Over here is Darfur. Some of these names you may recognize. Garcilla, Nyala is the capital, which you've heard a lot about. Al-Sarif and Al-Salam. These are internally, that's for internally displaced persons. Externally, it's refugees. When I look at these names, when I hear the numbers, by the way, 2 million people who are displaced from their homes from Darfur, 400,000 people who've died as a result of this conflict. I don't like to just think of it in large numbers because you know what? It's incomprehensible for me. I like to think of it in terms of individuals. You're going to meet a few of them in a minute. I like to think of them as that child, that woman, that man, that they lived with a life that was like ours, with family, with friends, with community. And then you have basically, and you'll hear from our experts, for all kinds of different reasons, geopolitical reasons, there's economic, there's global climate issues, but fundamentally, you have an Arab Islamic regime in Khartoum that seeks to eviscerate the people of Darfur who are African, a little bit darker skinned, people in Khartoum are lighter skinned, from the 4 Masalit and Zangawa tribes from the face of this earth. It is genocide. It is the evisceration of these human beings, these 6 million people they wish to get rid of for a variety of reasons. Let's just go on a little bit to a few more. Go ahead. Go ahead. This is all. If we had. Okay, these 3 children are my best friends in the Kunango refugee camp in Chad. This girl on the left, people, especially my sons, they always say, Dad, come on, you're a rabbi. You don't like even putting a Band-Aid on us. What could you be doing what do you do over there all day? And what I do is I do the following. During the day, I'm out playing with children, hundreds of children, old-fashioned games on the dirt, and the best part is watching their mothers. By the way, most of these camps have no men. The men are either dead or back in Darfur fighting. But to see the looks on the faces of the mothers of hope, that the world cares, and lest you have any cynicism about going over there and being in a camp and playing with children. For all those people throughout the 20th century, the Armenians, the Jews and the Christians during the Holocaust, 11 million who died, the people of Rwanda, they're looking to know that the world cares. People often ask Lee, well, do they know that you represent American Jewish World Service or this group or that group? Nobody gives a damn. But they see a white face and they do understand, hey, the world hasn't forgotten. Anyway, this girl on the right here, your left, I guess, my right. Your left, right? Yeah, your left. I sat and I played the old game of, hide the pebble between the hands and had her guess. This girl really got under my skin. She got it right every time. Then I started putting it behind my back. She got it right every time. And there was like 100 people gathered around. I want to ask any of you, how do you know that girl can't be the next Einstein? How do you know that girl can't be the woman that's going to find the cure for cancer? How do you know that that girl can't be the woman that's going to lead us to peace, to finally living in peace in this world? I don't know. I do my work, and from a humanitarian perspective, that's why we do our work, because we believe in the hope of who that young woman might be. Keeping her alive, getting her medical supplies, getting her food, getting her water until the water wakes up. It's for this young girl, Fatima, that I do some of my work. And just a few more slides. Somebody, go ahead. Okay, finally, and then I'll just wrap it up and turn it over to the other panelists. His name is Adam Musa. I wish he could be here. He can't. He's a teacher from Darfur. He saw his village destroyed. He saw what was his life taken away by the Janjaweed. He saw his world collapse. He and his wife and their 3 children, and then his brother's 3 children, his brother and sister-in-law were killed, came and they live in Kunango now. Actually, since the last trip, he no longer lives in Kunango for security reasons. His English is as good as ours. I think his intellect is as keen as ours. And he, for me, we always look at things, what really matters to us. And this was a note he wrote to me. It says, Kunango Refugee Camp, Eastern Chad, December 2005. And again, he understands very well he's Muslim, but he understands Judaism and Christianity, but a little bit conflated. It's okay. To my brother, Rabbi Lee, we wish you a happy Christmas. You know, kind of, actually, I liked it. Our love, gratitude, appreciation with the hopes from the faces of the children you had danced with them the day you visited the camp, Adam Musa. I think we do our work because of Fatima, because of Adam Musa. And in a short while, as I turn it over, you're going to hear about global warming, about the climate. You're going to hear about the geopolitical issues. You're going to hear about the human rights issues. But I want you to think of that first woman I showed you. I want you to think about Adam. I want you to think about the girl. And I want to ask you the following. Do you think they would understand any of those presentations? Do you think they care about oil flowing to Sudan? Do you think they care about any of these things? Until we take this in at the most profound human level, that in the year 2007, on this planet, in a place that we do bear some responsibility, that this kind of suffering is taking place, until we really take it in. I'm not saying give up your lives and move to Chad or Darfur, but I'm saying until we take it in of what evil is, of that we can do something. And for now, I'll end my comment with a quote by another mentor, a very famous rabbi of the 20th century by the name of Abraham Joshua Heschel. And he said the following: daily we should take account and ask, what have I done today to alleviate the anguish, to stop the humiliation? It goes on with that. I'll tell you why I love that quote. Daily, not when I feel like it, not when I'm in a good mood, not when things are right for me, but every day I need to take in the dispossessed, the forgotten, those who live under $1 a day, the billion people. I need to bring them into my life. And then the second part of the quote I love is the following: not what did you do, not what you do. We spend a lot of time doing that in our lives. What did I do today to alleviate the anguish, to prevent humiliation? What did I do? I think the more we can start asking that question at the deepest levels, that it's not her responsibility, it's your responsibility, it's my responsibility. I think that if we can ever in this country learn to work together, if we can ever say genocide does trump other things, and until we stop genocide, we ain't going to have a country or a planet that's going to work right. We're not going to be who we can be. Finally, this is about Adam. It's about the woman I first showed you, and it's about Fatima. It's also about us. Where were we in 2007? Where were we during this moment of controversy? Where were we during this moment? Did we respond? Did we react? Did we choose to be fully human? Thank you very much.
Awad Burma, Adam Harun, Adel Adam, Adef Umar, Mokhtar Umar, Isaac Ibrahim, Bahar Ahmed, Gamar El-Haj, Bakit Ahmed, Abdullah Umar.
During a routine visit to a hospital in Goj Beda, we came across a large number of wounded people. Many had been shot, others cut by machete. It seems that they had all come from a cluster of villages towards the border with Sudan. The survivors spoke of armed men on horseback and camels, many of them wearing Sudanese military uniforms. They spoke of how their cattle had been taken, how some had tried to resist, and how many had been slaughtered.
Adam Ibrahim.
We decided to investigate their claims. The journey took us onwards, 4 hours east and some 70 kilometers from the frontier. Here, in the increasingly anarchic border region, things were beginning to dissolve. Rebels had begun attacking government positions, and a proxy war had evolved, with Janjaweed incursions and a general culture of impunity. While President Deby was using the Chadian army to guard major towns, most of the villages in the countryside remained unprotected. Gathering their possessions, People had started to flee their homes.
Ahmed Ibrahim, Abdurrahim Saleh, Isa Harun, Ali Abakar, Adel Ahmed, Zakaria Hamid, Yahya Adam, Adam Abdurrahim, Kamis Hamid, Isa Ibrahim, Hussein Abakar.
Our guides led us to the village of Jawara.
Ahmed Ali Abu Hagaren, Haguren Ali, Musa Adam, Ibrahim Kumar,
It was deserted.
Sharahaf Hussein, Ahmed Abdul Khaltam, Adef Hassan, Tahir Abdul Karim, Osman Adam, Ibrahim Ahmed,
A survivor had described to us what took place here on April the 12th.
Ibrahim Ahmed,
He said,
Adam,
they came here on horse and on foot. The Janjaweed who entered the village began to shoot at us. They were too numerous and we were quickly overwhelmed. The Janjaweed kept shooting, looting and destroying. When people were hit by bullets during the attack and were falling on the ground, I saw 8 or 10 people rushing at them and finishing them off with machetes. I saw that more than 10 times.
Umar Abakar, Ibrahim Musa,
Sometimes it was 5 or 8 or 10 people rushing at them.
Abdul Maman El-Hajj,
There was a lot of noise during the attack, gunshots and yells. The assailants yelled things like, right here, right there. They are escaping that way. We have to kill them. Kill the Nuba. Kill the Nuba.
Hussein Hassan, Ahmed Suleiman, Abdur Rahman, Abdul Yamhim, Kuma Nagi, Gamar Zungin, Mukhtar Ismail, Isa Masan, Mahmoud Ismail.
Very difficult to intellectualize after images like that. Let me move on to the next segment of our program, where we will talk about the conditions in Darfur in hopes of gaining some understanding of how we can act effectively. So let me introduce our panel, and I will ask them to be brief in the interest of time, but focused. I'll introduce all 3 of them, and then step aside. Richard Falk is Professor Emeritus of International Law and Practice at Princeton University and is Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of California in Santa Barbara, where he teaches in our program and the Law and Society program. He is a prolific writer. Many of you, I think everybody in this room is familiar with his work since he is well connected with Human Rights Watch as well as our own program, so I won't read the list of things that he has written. I will mention that a number of years ago, in 2001, he served on a 3-person Human Rights Inquiry Commission for the Palestine territories appointed by the United Nations, and he previously served on the Independent International Commission on Kosovo. And he is considered one of the world's leading authorities on international law and human rights. Hilal Alver is also Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of California, also teaching in our program, Law and Society. Her previous position was Adjunct Professor of Comparative Law at Rutgers University School of Law. She earned her bachelor and PhD in law from the University of Ankara School of Law in Turkey, where she taught until 1993. During the 1990s, the Turkish government appointed her as a legal advisor to the Ministry of the Environment, then as a legal advisor and general director of women's status under the auspices of the Prime Minister. She's published on environmental and women's issues in Turkey, as well as a couple of years ago, a book on the peaceful uses of international rivers, the case of Euphrates and Tigris rivers. With that, we're so today. David Buchbinder is special researcher on Chad and Sudan at Human Rights Watch. He's been documenting attacks against civilians and other human rights abuses along the Chad-Sudan border since the end of 2005. Before that, he was a journalist in Southern Africa, South America, and Central Asia, where his writings appeared in the LA Times, Christian Science Monitor, and London Observer. At Human Rights Watch, David recently wrote, "They Came Here to Kill Us," a 70-page report which documented the deterioration in the human rights situation in eastern Chad, where more than 300 civilians were killed and 17,000 people displaced in November 2006 alone. He has recently returned from a follow-up mission to Chad, where he documented human rights abuses on all sides of the conflict. So let me first, Richard, why don't you begin?
I'm very glad to be part of this gathering. I think it's an exciting initiative to draw the academic communities together with civil society initiatives, and it happens very rarely, actually. It's a very good experiment. It's also difficult for me, in a certain sense, to speak after such moving, inspirational talks and images that have preceded my remarks, because I find in the title of our meeting today, "Understanding the Causes, Taking Responsibility for Action," that it's more difficult to move from understanding the conflict to taking responsibility for action than I would like it to be. In other words, there's the sense of moral clarity and the imperative of being responsible in relation to our own sense of human dignity, so well articulated by Rabbi Bycel. But to go from that common point of departure to knowing what to do at this stage of the conflict is much more difficult than I would like it to be. And I feel I have in a sense, the moral obligation to share with all of us this sense of political confusion as to the nature of the kind of response that will be really constructive. And let me suggest, because I want to be very brief, of course, that there are two clusters of issues that need to be addressed. The first, and in a sense, more obvious set of issues concern the requisite political will to be effective, assuming that there is sufficient clarity to take international action. Incidentally, the obstacle to acting in Sudan is not an obstacle based on international law. There is now a fairly clear commitment by all countries to support the so-called norm of a responsibility to protect vulnerable populations from genocide. That is an international responsibility. The United Nations, individual countries have that legal responsibility. But to go from that normative clarity, or the clarity of the legal foundation, to effectively implement that norm, that's a huge challenge, because, like it or not, the motivations of powerful political actors, including ourselves, our own country, is not primarily premised on moral considerations. Very seldom does one find a humanitarian intervention that is effective unless it's reinforced by formidable geopolitical self-interest. And that's just a fact of international life. The elites that run countries, including our own, are overwhelmingly subscribe to what is known professionally as the realist consensus. So how do you circumvent that realist consensus in order to mobilize effective action? But the other issue the other cluster of issues I think is more difficult, and that is, how do you achieve political clarity in relation to a set of circumstances that are exceedingly complex and that I believe pose a very fundamental moral challenge, and that is, we don't really know what will happen if we take certain kinds of coercive steps. See, it may give us a sense of satisfaction to characterize the conflict unambiguously as one of genocide, and then do as much as possible to criminalize the Khartoum regime and put as much pressure on it as we can. But there are increasing evidences from very knowledgeable observers that that route could conceivably intensify the tragedy in Darfur. Alex DeWaal, who's one of the most respected Darfur specialists and long dealt with humanitarian issues in Africa. He's the head of Justice Africa in London. Recently wrote, and I quote this from his very interesting essay, punitive and interventionist measures against Khartoum carry a high risk of sparking intensified conflict or bringing about governmental collapse, either of which would have calamitous humanitarian consequences. American leadership to avert such disasters is needed now. There's also increasingly been challenges to the mobilizing characterization of the situation as one of genocide. Mahmoud Mandani has an essay that's in our materials on the politics of naming, in which he argues strongly and eloquently, in my view, against the wisdom of attaching the label genocide to what has been transpiring in Darfur. And what he argues, in essence, is that this is a conflict that rests in its fundamental character on a situation of power sharing and resource conflict, resource scarcity, particularly land and water, and that if you want to solve that conflict, you've got to pursue a politics of accommodation and reconciliation, not a politics of criminalizing one side and, in effect, exonerating the other side. And the more you know about the genesis of the conflict, the more it becomes clear that it isn't so easy to pin all the blame on Khartoum, or to define the conflict along strictly ethnic and racist grounds. We now read recently, for instance, that some of the groups in Darfur that were previously opposed to one another, oddly enough, including some of the Janjaweed groups, are now having second thoughts and are in discussions with some of the African tribal groups in forming a joint alliance against the Khartoum regime. And there's a long history in Sudan, very complicated one that I obviously don't have time to discuss, of militias being formed by one or another political force and turning against those that formed the militia. There's also the whole sense that these problems in Darfur are one of the first direct consequences of global warming. That it is, in that sense, not a challenge to our human dignity so much, but to our standard of living, our carbon emissions, our contributions to global warming, that we do have a responsibility to protect that arises from this set of causes that before the droughts of the 1980s, which are attributed to global warming, there was no imbalance that expressed itself in terms of ethnic violence. There was a basically harmonious relationship. And therefore, again, it suggests we have to understand the causes of the conflict in order to get at the right solution. It may be satisfying to us to be able to achieve a specious moral clarity, but it may also deepen the tragedy for the people involved. So we have to have, in my view, part of moral responsibility is political humility, and especially when it comes to interfering in other societies. We have a very poor track record. Not only we as Americans, but all countries have a very poor track record when it comes to interventionary diplomacy. Having said all this, and I want to bring my remarks to a conclusion, lest our chair glare even more fiercely at me. Having said all this, I do not mean to suggest that Khartoum is not criminally responsible for crimes against humanity. This responsibility has been affirmed by the United Nations Inquiry Commission. What I'm really trying to say, and I would also say they bear primary responsibility. There's criminality on both sides, but the primary responsibility is clearly belongs to Khartoum for mobilizing these very vicious militias. But between the conclusion that this has been a criminal way of handling the Darfurian conflict and rebellion, and the attachment to that rebellion of genocide, that's where our difficulty lies at the moment. It's to casually presuppose that this should be treated as genocide is, in my view, a very dubious political move at this moment. And I say this realizing that most of the people that convened this event today probably disagree with that assessment. But final word, that when you say genocide, you are saying, in effect, that one side is criminal and the other side is victim. And you have to, you don't pursue a politics of reconciliation, you pursue a politics of vilification and a politics ultimately of pitting a solidarity with the good against the evil. And that's as close as I can come to a conclusion, that's the wrong way to go at this point. The right way to go, however difficult and however challenging in terms of political ambiguity, is to suggest the criminality of the Khartoum regime, but the necessity for a diplomatically weighted approach to containing the conflict, not letting the North-South conflict reemerge, which is one of the dangers of intervening, and finding a successful way of producing restoring some sort of accommodation to the region as quickly and as generously in terms of providing economic support as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for sharpening the issues in a very interesting and provocative way. We'll now hear from Hilal Elver, who will talk about the environmental aspects.
First of all, thank you very much that you are included environmental problems in the Darfur conflict, because not many journalists or recent writings, they really pay attention to environmental consequences of the problem. But if you look at the environmental politics books, Sudan is a text case, #1 case, how possible resource conflicts and scarcity will create an important conflict and a civil war and goes all the way to genocide. It is not a kind of obscure example from the environmental politics, and especially if you look at the environmental security perspective, Africa is one of the major continents that has a problem on the resource conflicts and scarcity, and also resource abundance. Not only scarcity, but the full of resources also create a problem. Sudan has both of them. Sudan had oil, which came out 1980s, very late, and founding an oil was not really a happy moment for Sudanese government because of the conflict that created, that the government, Khartoum government, was basically trying to control over the oil resources. That's why sometimes having an oil seems to be like a good thing, but after Iraq war, we know that having an oil is not a good thing. That's why Sudan also suffer because of the oil resources. And then another problem that environmental security looks at the Sudanese case, the scarcity of the resources. The scarcity of resources, land, and especially arable land, and the water scarcity. How did it come? How did it happen? And then, of course, after 1990s, we saw that climate change significantly affected the scarcity problems in Africa, not only Sudan. Many of the problems right now, if you look at Africa, all of them are directly, not even indirectly, connected with environmental scarcity problem and resource conflicts. For instance, if you look at the Rwanda, same thing. If you look at the Nigeria, same thing. They all are about resource conflicts. Not Africans are not very civilized, that's why they kill each other. That's not such simple. It is good to see simplistically from outside, but inside, and basically many of the conscientious academics don't look at from this perspective that Africa is underdeveloped, and because of this reason, a lot of conflicts are coming. Another reason, not only environment, the, of course, major colonial period that is the leftover in Sudan brought a lot of problem. Not only Sudan, in many African countries too, but if in the specificity of the Sudan, we should look at a little bit what happened historically. And also many of the writings about Sudan, they completely don't look at the historical development, how this problem came until today. Neither environment nor history is subject of the problematic of Sudan. If you look at the history, Sudan was under the control of the Ottoman Egypt domination in 18th century and until to end of First World War, and British came and took over the place from Ottomans. During the Ottoman period, they had a very interesting land system in Sudan, which means property rights, land property rights was basically belonged to ethnic groups as a communal property. This is very, very important because individual property was not existed in the Ottoman period. If you look at the whole Middle East, you see the same kind of land system in Middle East. Many of them are still going on. Many of them unfortunately created a conflict. In Sudan, this property rights that basically based on communality from the ethnic and tribal distinction, during the British period transformed to the common law property issues. This made a problem in Sudan in 1970s and 80s. But still, there was not a big problem, especially in Darfur area, because Darfur, which is basically what we look at, the conflict between farmers and the herders, if you look at generally. Two groups of people, they are living in Darfur, landowners that they are completely there and they do agricultural activity, and the herders, which is pastoral tribes that they are basically nomads. They are coming and going back. They don't stay there. Basically, if we look at the general Sudan, we have North Sudan and South Sudan. And also, if you look at the Khartoum, we have North Khartoum and South Khartoum. The South Khartoum is basically more, let's say, they have more water, more resources than the North. The northern group basically were coming to the South to take care of their animals in the southern farming area, and then after a certain period, they were going back again. In this exchange, the farmers, which is the landowners of the South, they were getting certain kind of rent as like a milk, meat. It's very kind of traditional exchange, but it was working very well. Certain period of year, they were staying there, they were taking care of their animals, and they were living certain part of their animals to the landowners. But when draft came in 1980s, actually it's not the first draft in 1980s, before even the draft came 3 or 4 times earlier than 80s, but 80s made more problematic because central government pushed this kind of tribal domination at this period. And this tribal domination and ethnic conflicts came together with the resource problems because there was not enough water, and the landowners became much more stronger because land prices went up, property prices went up, and population extended, especially internal displacement make serious problem over the land ownership. Then they decided to ask more rent from the animal owners. And then the animal owners were not able, herders were not able to pay this rent, then the conflict started. When conflict started, generally they had a traditional dispute resolution system, but under the influence of the British government, this dispute resolution system completely forgotten, but they did not replace regular kind of litigation which common law system will support. It seems to be like a traditional dispute resolution abandoned, but the modern legal system were not replaced. That was also a problem, how they solved the problem. And then this land dispute that became political issue. When it became political issue, then groups divided between religious and ethnic identity. Everyone took their part, just like it happened in Yugoslavia. Then there was enough resource, everybody was happy, but the resource conflicts and scarcity came. Now we became part of our tribals. Look what happened in Iraq. Same thing, when the problem came, everyone started to talk about, are we Shia or are we Sunni, which part we have to fight. It's exactly happened in Sudan too. This is in generally what is happening and how did it start, not what is happening. But it is not only this, of course. There are other geopolitical problems in Sudan. The neighboring countries are always interested in Sudanese politics, and the Sudanese politics also influence the neighboring countries. The Libya was always important component of the Sudanese politics, and they basically supported Arabs, which is central government. But the Libyans were not the first. The first, when British came, they supported also Arab population, and actually many of the Arabs came from Egypt, which is British government also owned the as a colonial power was also in Egypt. There's another issue that basically we don't see in general arguments. As you know, Nile is one of the important rivers in Africa and shared by 9 African countries. And during the British colonial period, they did have an international agreement how to share Nile waters among the riparian countries. And the British government gave 95% of the sharing to Egypt. The reason was after they lost India, they decided to replace the Egypt for the cotton production. The cotton production was very important, needed a water, and this water agreement by the British government, basically lion's share was given to Egyptians. Because of this reason, Sudan has a very little water resources, despite is an upstream country, but they are not able to develop any of the, they were not able to develop water resources many years. This created also water problem, and during the drought period, the water completely disappeared. They were not able to use kind of irrigation system that they have been using. If you look at right now, all these problems, and the climate change came top of it. And as we all know, climate change affects differently different parts of the world. Unfortunately, Africa is one of the major victims of the climate change because of the less of the rainfall, which is very, very important part of the water resources, the rivers and also mountains, snow melting resources was very, very important. And the effect of the climate change made the environmental security problems more complicated, and 50% of the rain resources has been lost last 10, 20 years in Africa, which is directly affected Darfur. And also desertification and deforestation started because people were trying to cut the wood because they needed a kind of energy resources. They had to cut their forests, and deforestation is another problem. This issue is interestingly enough, 3-4 days ago there were a meeting among the major retired generals in the United States. They decided to look for how climate change will affect American national security, which was a very interesting report actually, just 3-4 days ago has been published. If you look at this report, it's very interesting. They say American interests should stop or should do something about the climate change because this will be directly affect our national security. And there's a little chapter about Africa, how Africa is important for American people. I just give you a little example. Do I have it 2-3 minutes? 1 minute. Okay, then why Africa is important for Americans? One, the weak government, rising presence of the terrorism. Of course, this is a major important point for the U.S. Security. Many of the countries are Muslim. If they become poorer and poorer, terrorism activity is coming. Another reason is strategic value. You will be surprised at what they say. Supply of energy, oil, 25% to 40% by 2015, it will be the Africa for United States, not Middle East. There is a new kind of oil resource interest on Africa. And then there are other minerals is very important for United States, chrome, platinum, and manganese. That's why we have to care about Africa. And at the end, they say, we are also good people. We have to care about Africa, because if we don't do it right now, this will be seriously affects us directly and indirectly, especially refugee problems are important. We have to protect also our European partners, because African refugees generally go to Europe than the United States. That's why they try to find a kind of common solution that basically exploded by the climate change, but it was already there. Thank you.
We've heard two excellent presentations which have shown how complicated the situation in Darfur is. The difficulty with complexifying things is that it can also lead us to forget the human toll, which we began with. Our last presenter will take us back to the people. And whatever the causes, I think it's important to bear in mind those images that Rabbi Bycel put up initially and think of our obligation to them. So now it's my pleasure to introduce David Buchbinder from Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. I feel very well preceded. Those were great presentations. I want to thank especially Lee Bycel. I think that you hit on some of the very fundamental truths that need to be understood to understand what's happening. Basically, the idea of humanizing people. And funnily, that really does involve complexity. I'm not going to present I'm not going to make a simple presentation. I'm going to make a complex presentation because I think that is crucial to understanding. So this video that we saw was based on, well, that photographer was with me when I did a research mission to an area known as Darfur in southeastern Chad, where there's been a lot of violence. And so what I do is I go, I document, I write a report, and then I do advocacy, which for me means talking to people in UN country team, in New York, wherever, go to Washington, talk to people in Washington to help them understand what's going on. And then we also have advocates that push, like this report that I just wrote, in the same, through the same channels. So what happened in Jawara? Jawara was a Dajo village in southeastern Chad, and it was about 75 kilometers from the Sudan border. And it became part of a pattern of violence that I was documenting beginning in January 2006, right along the Chad-Sudan border, where there are a lot of villages that were being attacked, non-Arab villages that were being attacked by what were identified as Janjaweed militias. Then in April, this massacre happened in Jawara, and that was a change in that pattern because it was happening deeper into Chad. What happened on April 12th? Well, April 12th, there was also a Chadian rebel column heading toward N'Djamena, and they reached N'Djamena, the capital of Chad. That Chadian rebel column, which is based in Darfur, they were fighting on the streets of N'Djamena on April 13th. At that very same time, this village, Jawara, was being attacked by what was identified as a Janjaweed militia, and a massacre took place. So this violence that's happening in Darfur, an area where I spent a lot of time, is happening in a power vacuum. The government of Chad has withdrawn its forces to fight against these Chadian rebels based in Darfur. They've left open huge areas of eastern Chad along the border, basically exposed, and in this power vacuum we have a lot of militia activity. Janjaweed, I put brackets around the term Janjaweed. I'm not comfortable using it. In this context, to Human Rights Watch, we have a definition of what Janjaweed is. Janjaweed is a mostly Arab militia that was recruited in 2003 by the government of Sudan, Chadian and Sudanese Arab mix mostly, that was employed as a proxy by the government of Sudan in its counterinsurgency. So why such a very, very specific, precise definition? Well, because Janjaweed is a word that gets misused. And in eastern Chad, it just means basically anybody that attacked you is a Janjaweed, almost. So when I was doing this research in that area of Darfur, I had done some research down the further south. I was coming north, and there were burning village. There's burning fields. They were sort of smoking. I went to the village. I said, "What happened?" They said the Janjaweed attacked us. Well, after about 2 hours of research, talking to people, I realized, well, this was not a Janjaweed militia like what we have in Darfur. These were their neighbors, the Mimi. And the Mimi are, in Darfur, associated with the Arabs. They're non-Arab, but they are associated, they're close with the Arabs, they're friends with the Arabs, and are therefore sort of formulaically identified as Arabs, and then are furthermore formulaically identified as Janjaweed, right? So we have this sort of very casual, not fact-based association with this ethnic group. And this gets into some of these questions of identity that are so important, and all of the people who spoke before sort of touched on this theme, and to me it's also very important to understand, because identities here are, in southeastern Chad, along the Chad-Sudan border, are very plastic. A Mimi can be considered an Arab just by association. And, at the same time, these identities can become very rigid, right? So that Mimi who has become identified as an Arab, as a Janjaweed, can be killed because of that formulaic association, and so on. So it's important to understand that as we get into some of these issues of what are we going to do about Darfur and what are we going to do about Chad. So just another note about this question of identity. I had a very rare opportunity to speak with some Sudanese armed forces soldiers. These are Sudanese armed forces. They're, you know, a problem. They were committing horrible abuses in Darfur. And it was very rare for me to get the opportunity to speak with some of them, but I did in October. I was up in the far northwest of Chad, and there is a Sudanese refugee camp 2 kilometers away from the Sudanese border. So there's 26,000 Sudanese refugees in this camp. And in, long story, I won't get into it, but there was a Sudanese armed forces camp right across the border from this refugee camp in early October. What is that military force doing 2 kilometers away from a massive refugee center? Very concerning, very dangerous situation. And there was beginning to be some conflict between the two groups, some armed conflict, potentially explosive. What happened? Well, the Darfur rebels came out of Darfur and attacked that Sudan armed forces base, and they massacred them. That was a horrible defeat for the Sudanese armed forces. I met the survivors, I interviewed the survivors in a hospital in northeastern Chad. So I went through and talked to every single person who was in the Sudanese armed forces. For me, great access and a great lesson. So here are these Sudanese armed forces guys in the same hospital room with Darfur rebels. 2 days before, they were killing each other. In the hospital, they're lighting each other's cigarettes, right? And I went through and I spoke with them, and I met one guy. His name was Musa Yusuf. He was 24 years old. He was shot at point-blank range, 3 bullets through his body. He survived, but 18 out of 20 people in his unit were killed. It's just horrible violence. And what was his story? Well, he was 26 years old. He was forcibly recruited from Jebel Mara by the Sudanese armed forces when he was 15 years old, and he got dragged into this unit. And part of the reason I was talking to these people was I was trying to understand how the Sudanese were using aircraft, because this is part of the consideration of doing a no-fly zone. So I wanted to understand, okay, tell me about your use of aircraft. And they did. And one thing I learned is that they were getting resupplied by helicopters, painted white to look like UN helicopters. And what were the helicopters leaving with when they left this army, this remote base up in the far north west of Darfur? They were leaving with the light-skinned Arab Sudanese armed forces soldiers, right? So they were evacuating them from this very dangerous area. And I asked Musa Yusuf a very uncharacteristic question, because I'm looking at the human rights issues. But I asked him, when do you think there will be peace in Darfur? And he looked around and he said, when this hospital room has light-skinned Arabs in it, right? It was an all-black hospital. I looked around, he was completely right. So again, this gets into some of these questions of how we look at this conflict. And typically, it's been a lot of our media sources talk about it as Africans against, Arabs against Africans. And right away, the terminology is suspect, right? Because they're all Africans. This is Darfur. So then beyond that, you can also complexify not only the concept of who's African, but also of who's Arab, right? Because there's an Arabization, so there's plasticity in some of these definitions. So, okay, so that was my lesson that I learned up in the northwest of Darfur. Subsequently, I returned to this area where we saw this video, and called Darsila. And there's a lot of violence that we can sort of describe roughly as Arab against non-Arab. A lot of Arab militias are attacking non-Arabs. And what I did was I spent 2 weeks with the Salamat Arabs. This is an Arab sub-clan that's been associated with a lot of violence against non-Arabs in Chad. And I learned a lot from these 2 weeks with these Arabs. No doubt some of them have been responsible for atrocities and attacks against non-Arabs. And I did what I could to document that. But what I really wanted to understand was if there was backlash violence against the Arabs. And of course, in fact, there was. And I described this in one of my more recent reports. Another issue that came up with these Salamat Arabs was they're saying, hey, look, this is about the resources. They said, look, we're not nomads, right? We're semi-nomads. We don't move on the grand migration routes. We just sort of move locally. And water in this area, very, very important and very scarce. And in the wet season, no problem. But in the dry season, everybody has to use the same dry riverbeds to get their water. What the Salamat Arabs said was, well, look, there's been radical demographic change in the last 3 years. There's 140,000 Chadians displaced right in this area, in addition to 30,000 or so refugees. And that's okay in the wet season, but in the dry season, we got a major problem because these sedentary farmers are expanding the area under cultivation. And so, yeah, of course we trample their fields. How else do we get to the water? So there's a water problem there, a water land problem. And why are these issues of identity so important? Because you realize that humanitarian aid can get very easily politicized. So if there is a conflict over water, and if the area of land under cultivation is under expansion among the non-Arabs, well, what's being done about it? I called a nonprofit that does a lot of work in drilling water in Chad. I said, hey, do you have any water programs in southeastern Chad? They said, yeah, we have 1 million of them. And I said, do you have any in Arab areas? No, actually, we have 0 of them. Well, right there, unintentionally, that humanitarian aid has become politicized. It is, this is what the Arabs told me. They said, hey, UN, that's for the non-Arabs. It's not for us. Now, there's a structural problem because the non-Arabs are in an emergency situation, right? They need emergency aid, right? So that's a very high priority. The Arabs, well, they might be considered development aid because they're not in the same crisis. First of all, wrong. If you go to the Arab areas, they'll take you to their huts, and they'll say, these people all have gunshot wounds from conflict, retaliatory violence. They're not going to hospitals, not being evacuated to hospitals, partly because of this whole issue, this sort of simple understanding of Arabs as Janjaweed killers, right? So they are sort of isolated that way. Many of the speakers who came before me talked about this oversimplified narrative that we have, and that's what I'm getting at here too. There's a sort of a Manichaean sense of the Arabs are evil, the non-Arabs are victims, and it's very crucial to sort of get beyond that, to complicate that. But however, I have to say that I think that the oversimplified narrative that many, like Christoph, gets criticized for is very important and plays a very important role, especially in Africa. People are indifferent to, the United States, or most of the world. They don't care what happens in Africa. Africa's off the map. Economically significant, insignificant. If Africa disappeared tomorrow, no change in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's just, this is the fact of the matter. So to get people in the Western world where the power lies to care, well, maybe you do need this emotional, very oversimplified narrative about what's going on. Very important. What's happened in Darfur, I think, is good because we're all here. Darfur is a household word. Very unusual for Africa. Didn't happen in the Congo Civil War. It's happening now. That's good. But then what happens when you are then on the level of making policy? Why is it dangerous? What is wrong with this oversimplified narrative? Well, because when you're starting to think about making policy, you're potentially making it based on an oversimplification. So I had a person, very influential, come to me after I'd done this research with the Salamat Arabs, right, who are very locally, casually referred to as the Janjaweed. He says, David, here's what we're thinking. We're going to get some rapid reaction brigades with some attack helicopters, go in there, take out those Janjaweed. What do you think of that? I said, I don't think it's a good idea. I think that this, so and so we, as an advocacy community, have done, I think, a very good job by making ourselves aware about what's going on. But now, as things are shifting, I think, a little bit into, okay, what are we going to do about the problem? Now I think we need the complexity. And policymakers don't like complexity, right? Like, it's too complicated. It's just Africans. It's like, let them deal with it. African violence, it's beyond us. But they need to be enjoined to embrace that complexity and to build it into their way of solving the problem, because the Darfur conflict is a long time in the making, and it's not going to be an easy silver bullet solution. It's a multifactorial problem, needs multifactorial solutions, and investment of time, right? So, yeah, you need a simple understanding to get a simple solution, but we need a complex solution. And beyond the sort of the policy level, there's just the level of humanity, which Lee Bycel was talking about, which I think is so important. So why is it that with the Blacksburg, Virginia, when I see on television that there are 33 or 32 students killed, that I'm affected by that? March 31st, I was in eastern Chad. 65 people were killed in Chiero. It's a village in eastern Chad. Why don't, and even I, right? I mean, I'm not a callous person. I'm in eastern Chad all the time. Why does that affect me differently? Well, number of reasons, but I think one reason is that we have a lot of details about what happened in Blacksburg. These people are humanized. They're not, I mean, I don't know them. I don't know anybody in Virginia Tech, but I've read about them. I've learned about them. They've become human beings to me. That makes me care. The 65 people who were killed in Chiero are a statistic, right? So, of course, there's nothing wrong with me or any of us for having no emotional investment in people who, people who died, who remain on sort of anonymous level. So when we go beyond that, when we humanize them, like what some of the speakers before me did, well, that sort of, and this is what Lee was talking about, is expanding, is becoming more human. And we can become more human by expanding our sense of humanity and humanizing these people. And, of course, so you get into the paradox. Statistics are very important. When I was documenting this massacre, we went through, people gave us lists of names, we cross-referenced the names, we canceled out the duplicates, we talked to numerous survivors, we got a long list of names. After a lot of work, we came up with the best number that we could get, which was 118 dead. Now, in that, we published a press release, and it got worldwide coverage, 118 dead in Chad. But what if we'd only found 99 dead? Well, it might not have gotten worldwide coverage. And the same thing, there are 140,000 IDPs in southeastern Chad, in Darfur, where I work. 140,000 IDP, that's a number and an acronym. These are not human beings. So if I read an article, 140,000 IDPs, it's just not going to hit me, because this is just a very abstract level. So this is I think where we can go now is into some of the complexity. I think that's the way forward. Thank you.